You know what they say, those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it. So as our country is on the verge of a potential tariff war with the United States, what lessons can we take from history to approach this moment? Raymond Blake is a history professor at the University of Regina. He joins us now to discuss this. Good morning, Raymond.
Good morning. Thank you very much for having me.
You're very welcome. So, Raymond, when we think about this looming tariff war with the U.S., our closest neighbors and historical allies, what moments come to mind as being historical markers for you that stand out for where this could lead us?
Well, I guess you can find all sorts of precedents in the past for the present, and trade is certainly one of them. And I suppose one that really pops out is right after the American Civil War in the 1860s. The Americans did have a free trade deal with what was then British North America and Great Britain. We'll call it Canada. And they canceled that treaty just before the Canadians realized, oh my, what are we going to do for markets? And they decided, well, how about if we join together all the British colonies in North America and we'll trade amongst ourselves and we probably won't need the Americans too much.
When it comes to historical comparisons between the U.S. and Canada, where there's been sort of frosty relationships, let's say, and this is seemingly one maybe at the moment we're at, what comes to mind historically over the last, 200 years?
Well, if you go back to the beginnings of the American state after the American Revolution, they pre-approved the entry of what was then Quebec into the American, with the 13 colonies. So the Americans always had this notion that European powers shouldn't be in North America. So Canada, when it became a separate nation in 1867, still had these ties to Great Britain. And even as late as 1920, the Canadians were preparing for an attack from the United States. But of course, that didn't happen. And quite often you would see the Americans, raising the issue, hey, how about Canada joining us? But it really did disappear. Certainly, after 1867, and really never came back. And no one talked about annexation. That was a word from the mid-19th century. So last, 150 years, that has been a non-starter.
It really seems to be catching people off guard a little bit with this continued discussion of the 51st state and annexation. And when you talk about other parts of the world where the U.S. has, let's say, taken over territories, they've never really discussed, as you said, Canada as an option. Just how rare is it for a country like Canada to be discussed in this way by a power like the U.S.?
Oh, I think it's very rare. And I think the Americans were always a little worried about certain things in Canada, one of which is where, you are today, in Saskatchewan. And in the 1940s, this move towards the left, the socialists coming to power. And one of the things that the Americans were really concerned about is, we don't want the socialists, which they saw as communists, having, considerable influence in Canada. So the Americans were quite willing, say, during the Second World War, to make sure that the Canadian economy prospered, that they invested in Canada, that the Canadians would be just like them in many ways. And so the Americans were concerned about Canada, but certainly not to the point of invading. So this is very, very rare indeed.
When it comes to a national identity and Canada and Canada's history, and you mentioned things like, the World War and times where, let's say, Canadians came together, and this seems to be sort of a unifying moment. We have some politicians from different stripes speaking from the same songbook. He's talking about Team Canada. You have people looking into buy Canadian. We want to maybe stay in Canada for travel. Has this happened in the past in big examples of this in Canada's history?
Well, there's always been a great concern of American cultural and economic influence. Some people would say dominance in Canada. But certainly what we are seeing today, it's a bit ironic in a way with our current prime minister, waving the Canadian flag in a way that he hasn't done in his time in office, 2015. And the last prime minister we had that was really nationalistic was Stephen Harper. And one of the things that Stephen Harper did was, to try to militarize Canada. Some people argued take it back to a different time period. And when Mr. Trudeau came along, and many of the people who supported him said, "Oh, we got to get rid of that. This sort of nationalism is just too much. We're not." This is not what Canadians do. And so as Mr. Trudeau's out the door, he's sort of taking a page out of Mr. Harper's playbook, which is really bizarre. And it probably shows how worried the political leadership is right now. And for dismissing, the things about Canada that other prime ministers really promoted. And Mr. Trudeau said even, Canada is a post-national state. It has no core values. It has no core national identity. And then when Mr. Trump comes along, the rise in patriotism in the recent poll just a couple of days ago showed it's up like 15-20% in the last 2 weeks. So this is quite extraordinary. And if Canadians were worried about the lack of pride in Canada, the lack of patriotism, it's ironic that it's Mr. Trump that is now sort of driving this national feeling in Canada and pride in being Canadian, which a number of people have argued really took a hit during Mr. Trudeau's time in office since 2015.
When you talk about the president, are there historical comparisons to him and what he's doing? Because I know there, from day to day, his explanation for the tariffs, for example, are changing, and he's so unpredictable with what he's saying. Do we have recent or historical examples that you think in your head that goes, he's drawing comparisons to me of this person?
Well, no, I think we've seen nothing like Mr. Trump. And, one of the things that Canadians have always to worry a little bit about is the Americans. The question you asked earlier, the Americans wanted Canada to behave in a particular way. If you go back to the 1930s, I'll give you a couple of examples. You go back to the 1930s, when the Canadian Prime Minister R.B. Bennett said we're going to blast our way into the world markets by increasing Canadian tariffs. Well, when Franklin D. Roosevelt became President of the United States, he sort of going to lower tariffs, and he and the Canadians were talking about doing this, but he waited until after the election in 1935 to do it because he did not want R.B. Bennett to remain as prime minister because he didn't like his particular approach. And of course, we all know about the Saskatchewan-born prime minister John Diefenbaker, who complained to his grave that it was the operatives within the Democratic Party who undermined his government or helped undermine his government, and they worked with the Liberals to kick him out of office. And even during Mr. Trudeau's recent campaigns, Barack Obama did a tweet that says, this is a great person. So Americans have always been sort of involved in the background. I shouldn't say always, have been periodically, but nobody as open as this. But it's very clear, too. I think Mr. Trudeau and Mr. Trump, they don't like each other very much.
Raymond, thanks so much for making time for us today and sharing your expertise. We appreciate it.